"Excuse me, are you here about the competency evaluation?" the receptionist asked loudly across the crowded waiting area of Heritage Community Bank, where I'd been sitting for 15 minutes waiting to meet with my personal banker. "Your son called ahead and explained your situation." 25 pairs of eyes turned toward me as I sat in the business customer seating area, holding my appointment confirmation and identification documents. Other customers stared with mixture of curiosity and discomfort, watching what appeared to be an elderly man being publicly identified as mentally incompetent. "Dad, thank you for coming in today," my son Michael said, approaching from the customer service desk where he'd apparently been preparing bank staff for my arrival. "I know this is confusing for you, but the bank needs to verify your capacity to make financial decisions." Behind the counter, 3 tellers had paused their work to observe the situation. Several customers were discreetly recording what they assumed was another elderly person struggling with banking procedures, their phones capturing what appeared to be a family intervention. "He's been showing concerning signs lately," Michael explained to the gathering crowd, his voice carrying perfectly across the marble lobby. "Memory lapses, poor judgment with money, difficulty understanding basic procedures. We're working with his doctor to ensure he's protected from making harmful financial decisions." I stayed quiet, gripping my wallet that contained decades of federal identification cards Michael had never seen. They mistook my silence for weakness. But Michael didn't know who I was. He didn't know that I'd spent 38 years as a federal bankruptcy judge, overseeing complex financial cases and guardianship proceedings. He didn't know that I understood every legal maneuver he was attempting, every procedural requirement he was trying to manipulate. And this didn't start today. It started 6 weeks ago when I'd foolishly mentioned my retirement account balances during what I'd thought was a casual family dinner. But the real warning had come at 2 o'clock this morning, when my banker called with urgent news that would change everything. And that was only the beginning. I should have noticed the first sign 6 weeks earlier, when Michael started asking unusually detailed questions about my estate planning during what was supposed to be a relaxing Sunday barbecue at my house. He'd waited until his wife Lisa was inside helping with dishes, then cornered me on the back deck with questions that seemed caring but felt calculated. "Dad, have you updated your will recently? Do you have healthcare directives in place? What happens to your accounts if something medical occurs?" I'd mentioned that retirement was treating me well financially, that my federal pension combined with conservative investments had left me comfortable. Michael kept pushing, asking about account numbers, beneficiary designations, power of attorney arrangements. "You know, Dad, you should consider adding me as an authorized user on your checking account, just for emergencies. What if you're hospitalized and can't pay bills?" The suggestion seemed reasonable from a caring son concerned about his aging father's welfare. Michael worked as a financial planner, understood complex account structures and legal procedures better than most people. I'd thought he was being helpful when he offered to review my retirement planning, but everything truly shifted at 2 o'clock this morning when I was jolted awake by my phone ringing. The caller ID showed David Chen from Heritage Community Bank, my personal banker for the past 12 years. In all that time, David had never called after business hours, never contacted me about anything urgent enough to interrupt his sleep. "Mr. Edward, I'm so sorry to wake you," David whispered urgently, his voice barely audible, "but I need you to listen very carefully. Please, don't tell your son about this conversation. Can you promise me that?" My stomach clenched at the desperation in his tone. "David, what's wrong? Why can't I tell Michael?" "Sir, your son filed guardianship paperwork with the probate court yesterday afternoon. He's claiming you're mentally incompetent and requesting immediate emergency authority over all your financial accounts." The room started spinning as his words sank in. Guardianship meant legal control over every aspect of my life, my money, my property, my medical decisions, even where I could live. "The court clerk is a friend of mine," David continued quietly. "She called me as a courtesy because she recognized your name from bank documentation. The hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. If you don't appear with legal representation, the judge will likely grant temporary guardianship based on Michael's sworn testimony. In all my years on the bench, I'd seen guardianship papers ruin lives, but I never imagined my own son would file them against me. I should have noticed the first sign. The next morning brought clarity when I arrived at David's office, and he showed me copies of the guardianship petition that activated every judicial instinct I'd developed during 4 decades on the federal bench. What David didn't know was that I wasn't just a retired federal employee. I was the Honorable Edward Harrison, former Chief Bankruptcy Judge for the Northern District. I'd spent 38 years presiding over complex financial cases, including hundreds of guardianship proceedings and elder exploitation cases. I'd overseen guardianship hearings involving sophisticated financial fraud, where family members attempted to gain legal control over elderly relatives' assets. I understood every legal requirement, every procedural safeguard, every tactic that unscrupulous petitioners used to manipulate the system. But I'd retired quietly 5 years ago, choosing anonymity in suburban life after my wife, Patricia, passed away. We'd been married 43 years, and she'd been the center of my world. Without her, I felt disconnected from the legal community that had once defined my identity. Michael had seen my grief in isolation, calculated that a widowed retiree would be vulnerable to legal manipulation. He'd researched my visible assets but had never investigated my professional background or the extensive legal network I'd maintained throughout my judicial career. Patricia had always been proud of my work protecting vulnerable people from financial exploitation. She'd attended countless judicial conferences where I'd presented papers on guardianship abuse, elder financial crimes, and procedural reforms designed to prevent exactly what Michael was attempting. Michael was about to learn that targeting a former federal bankruptcy judge for guardianship fraud was the most expensive mistake of his legal career. But the real shock came later that morning when I realized how extensively he'd been planning to destroy everything Patricia and I had built together. That morning felt even heavier when David showed me evidence that Michael had been systematically documenting my supposed cognitive decline, while researching procedures for gaining complete legal control over everything Patricia and I had accumulated during 43 years of marriage. Someone has been photographing your routine activities, documenting your daily schedule, and creating a timeline of what they're calling concerning behaviors, David explained, spreading documents across his desk. They've also researched your medical history and contacted your primary care physician requesting mental health evaluations. But the documentation was only part of Michael's plan. David had discovered that the guardianship petition included requests for immediate authority over my house, my federal pension, my investment accounts, and even Patricia's jewelry that I'd planned to leave to our granddaughter. The petition claims you've been exhibiting signs of dementia, making poor financial decisions, and expressing paranoid thoughts about family members trying to harm you, David continued. They've submitted sworn affidavits from multiple witnesses describing incidents of confusion and inappropriate behavior. Michael intended to have me declared legally incompetent, then gain court-ordered authority over every aspect of my life. He'd calculated that an elderly widower wouldn't understand the legal complexities involved in challenging guardianship proceedings. There's more, David said, pulling out additional documents. They've researched assisted living facilities that specialize in housing individuals with court-appointed guardians. The plan appears to be complete institutionalization while they liquidate your assets. But Michael had made a fundamental miscalculation about his target. He'd seen a 74-year-old retired man living quietly in suburban anonymity and assumed I lacked the legal expertise to recognize systematic guardianship fraud. He'd never considered that some quiet old men had spent their careers presiding over cases exactly like this one, understanding every procedural requirement, every legal safeguard, every tactic used by predators who exploited vulnerable elderly people. He had no idea who he was dealing with. But Michael made his critical mistake when he submitted forged medical documentation claiming I'd been diagnosed with progressive dementia, using letterhead from Dr. Sarah's office without her knowledge or consent. The fraudulent medical reports triggered automatic verification procedures that exposed his entire scheme. The medical records Michael submitted contained diagnostic codes and terminology that Dr. Sarah never uses, David explained, showing me side-by-side comparisons of authentic and forged documents. More importantly, the signature analysis shows clear inconsistencies with her actual handwriting samples. As a federal judge, I'd overseen dozens of cases involving forged court documents and fraudulent medical records. Michael's forgeries were sophisticated but not perfect. He'd missed subtle formatting requirements and authentication procedures that any experienced legal professional would immediately recognize. "There's something else," David continued, his voice heavy with professional outrage. "The person who submitted these documents also attempted to access your safe deposit box yesterday, claiming authority under the guardianship petition that hasn't even been approved yet." The level of premeditation was staggering. Michael had spent months building a comprehensive case for my incompetence while creating fraudulent documentation to support emergency guardianship proceedings. He'd researched every aspect of elder guardianship law, but he'd made critical errors that any experienced judge would spot immediately. "I've contacted the court clerk who originally called me," David explained. "She's flagged the case for detailed judicial review due to irregularities in the supporting documentation." Michael had left a paper trail that any competent investigator could follow directly to criminal charges. His financial planning background had given him knowledge of guardianship procedures, but he'd forgotten that banks maintain comprehensive audit logs and that forged medical records are felony offenses. He was about to learn that attempting guardianship fraud against a former federal bankruptcy judge was the most expensive mistake of his criminal career. That mistake cost him everything, and I knew the trap was closing around Michael when David introduced me to Detective Williams from the Elder Abuse Division and Attorney Patricia from the State Attorney General's office. The investigation had expanded rapidly once multiple institutions reported coordinated fraud attempts involving forged medical records and false guardianship petitions. "Mr. Hedward, we've discovered that your son has created an extensive infrastructure for stealing your entire estate through fraudulent guardianship proceedings," Detective Williams explained. "Forged medical records, false witness statements, and systematic documentation designed to support claims of incompetence." The evidence was overwhelming and sophisticated. Michael had spent months photographing my daily activities, creating a false narrative of cognitive decline while researching legal procedures for emergency guardianship. He'd even contacted former colleagues, claiming concern about my mental health. We've also found correspondence between Michael and assisted living facilities that specialize in housing individuals with court-appointed guardians, Attorney Patricia added. The plan was systematic. Gain guardianship, institutionalize you, liquidate all assets, and maintain legal control indefinitely. David spread additional evidence across his desk: screenshots of Michael's internet searches, copies of facility brochures he'd downloaded, research into asset liquidation procedures and guardianship fee structures that would have generated ongoing income. His plan was remarkably thorough, Detective Williams noted. File emergency guardianship petition, present forged medical evidence, gain temporary authority, move you to institutional care, and begin systematic asset liquidation within weeks. But what Michael didn't understand was that he'd targeted someone with intimate knowledge of exactly these types of criminal schemes. I'd presided over similar cases for decades, understood every technique he was using, recognized every pattern in his fraudulent behavior. The investigation had also revealed that I wasn't his first target. Michael had been researching similar cases involving elderly clients at his financial planning firm, building expertise in guardianship procedures while identifying potential victims. The trap was almost ready. That evening felt surreal when Michael called to check on my emotional state, his voice carrying the same concerned affection he'd used for months, while systematically planning to steal everything Patricia and I had built during our marriage. "Hey, Dad, I've been worried about you since the bank incident today. Are you feeling confused about financial procedures? Maybe I should come over and help you understand what's happening." I could hear the calculation behind his concerned tone. Michael was probably monitoring court records, wondering if his guardianship petition had been processed yet, calculating when he'd gain legal authority over my accounts. "Actually, Michael, I had some very interesting conversations today," I replied calmly, "with my banker, with some investigators, with an attorney from the State Attorney General's office." There was a long pause before he responded, and I could practically hear his mental gears spinning as he tried to assess whether his fraudulent petition had been detected by law enforcement. "Dad, that sounds serious. What kind of investigators?" "The kind who specialize in guardianship fraud, elder exploitation, and forged medical records. They seemed very interested in your petition and the documentation you submitted to the probate court." Michael's breathing had become rapid and shallow. He was realizing that his months of criminal planning had been completely uncovered by investigators who understood guardianship law far better than he did. "Dad, I think there might be some misunderstanding about my intentions," Michael said desperately. "I was just trying to help you manage complex financial decisions. Maybe I should come over so we can discuss this properly." But his voice was shaking now. Michael understood that his criminal enterprise was collapsing, that law enforcement agencies were probably preparing felony charges while we spoke. He was losing control. That night, the calm before Michael's destruction felt heavy with grief for Patricia and rage at his betrayal of everything she'd represented in our family. I sat in our bedroom, holding her wedding ring and reviewing the comprehensive evidence file the investigators had assembled. The investigation had revealed that Michael's fraud was even more extensive than initially discovered. Over 6 months, he'd created false documentation, forged medical records, and built systematic infrastructure for stealing everything Patricia and I had worked for during 4 decades of federal service. "Mr. Edward," Detective Williams had explained during our final briefing, "your son's computer contains detailed research into having you committed to a secured memory care facility in another state, far from anyone who might question the guardianship arrangement or advocate for your welfare." The evidence painted a picture of calculated cruelty that went far beyond simple theft. Michael had planned to destroy my life completely, steal our assets, sell our house, have me declared legally incompetent, and warehouse me in institutional care, where I'd never be able to expose his crimes or maintain Patricia's memory. I thought about our 43 years together, the federal judicial conferences we'd attended, the elder exploitation cases I'd presided over, where I'd protected other families from predators exactly like my own son. Tomorrow morning, state and federal agents would arrest Michael on charges that would send him to prison for decades. Lisa would discover that her husband was a career criminal who'd been planning to destroy his own father for money, but I wanted Michael to understand exactly who he'd chosen to victimize, exactly what legal expertise he'd attempted to manipulate, before his arrest ended any possibility of family reconciliation forever. Tomorrow, everything would change. But the confrontation came quietly when I invited Michael to breakfast at our house, ostensibly to discuss signing the guardianship documents he'd been pushing me to accept. His eagerness was obvious as he approached our front door, probably calculating how quickly he could complete his legal theft. "Dad, I'm so relieved you're finally being reasonable about this situation," he began, settling into Patricia's favorite chair at our kitchen table. "The guardianship will protect you from making financial mistakes and ensure you get proper care." I looked at him calmly across the table where Patricia and I had shared breakfast for 43 years. "Michael, before we sign anything, there are some things you need to understand about guardianship law and the documentation you've submitted." "What do you mean?" "I know about the forged medical records from Dr. Sarah's office. I know about the false witness statements and the fraudulent competency claims. I know about your research into assisted living facilities and asset liquidation procedures." The silence that followed was absolute. Michael's face went completely pale as he realized the full scope of his exposure. "Dad, I can explain everything," he whispered. I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was trying to protect your assets from poor financial decisions. Elderly people need guidance managing complex legal matters. By forging medical records and submitting fraudulent petitions to probate court, you've been showing signs of confusion since Mom died. You need professional oversight to prevent financial exploitation. Michael, I spent 38 years as Chief Bankruptcy Judge for the Northern District. I've presided over hundreds of guardianship proceedings involving exactly these types of fraudulent petitions. His face showed the moment he finally understood the magnitude of his miscalculation. For months, he'd been systematically planning to defraud someone whose entire judicial career had been devoted to protecting elderly victims from guardianship exploitation. "You're not just a retired federal employee," he said slowly. "Chief Bankruptcy Judge. 38 years presiding over financial fraud cases and elder exploitation proceedings." He realized what I truly was, and justice came quietly the next morning, when state and federal agents arrived at Michael's house to execute arrest warrants on multiple felony charges. Detective Williams called to inform me that the arrest had proceeded without incident, though Michael had collapsed when he understood the federal prison sentence he was facing. Michael Harrison is being charged with elder abuse, guardianship fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit financial exploitation, and filing false documents with a federal court, Detective Williams explained. He's looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison. The asset forfeiture proceedings had frozen Michael's accounts and business assets pending investigation. The inquiry had also revealed that Michael owed significant gambling debts, explaining his desperate need for immediate access to my estate. Lisa filed for divorce within hours of the arrest, learning for the first time that her husband was a career criminal who'd been planning to have his own father declared incompetent and institutionalized. Their children would grow up knowing their father had tried to steal their grandfather's home and destroy his independence. The hardest part was explaining to my granddaughter that she wouldn't see her father for 15 years, that the college fund Patricia and I had established for her was safe only because we'd caught Michael before he could liquidate it through fraudulent guardianship proceedings. 6 months later, I testified before a federal judicial conference about guardianship reform, using Michael's case as an example of how sophisticated criminals exploit procedural weaknesses in elder protection systems. Patricia would have been proud that I'd used this terrible experience to help protect other families. The federal charges ensured that Michael would spend most of his remaining productive years in environments where his manipulation skills would prove entirely ineffective. Other elderly victims would be protected from his predatory behavior. Sometimes, the quietest revenge is simply allowing justice to follow its proper legal progression. Michael had calculated that an elderly widower would be easy prey for sophisticated guardianship fraud. He'd learned too late that respect for elders isn't just moral principle, it's practical protection against those who mistake judicial retirement for legal ignorance. But justice in federal court stays silent, patient, and inevitable as Patricia's memory.